When I was at Trinity Baptist College, we were. It was prior to me getting married, and I'm there as a student. And I went out to lunch, and over there on the west side, they were doing some road work. And as I was driving down the road, I had somebody that was in front of me, and all of a sudden he swerves. Okay, he takes this drastic turn. And it caught my attention, and I was trying to figure out what was going on, why he swerved. And as I kept going, I realized that the roads that we were driving on, they had been redone. So they had made a little swerve type thing there, a little bit of a curve there that we were not used to. And so we're driving on what has been our normal drive, our normal roadway. And then all of a sudden they've added this little turn to it, right? And so as we're driving, this guy, he swerves at the last second, and I see in front of him where he swerved, there was a barrier there, and I'm looking at the roads, and the road had not been painted over. The old lines had not been painted over yet, but the new lines were there. And so it was obvious, if you're paying attention, it was obvious where you're going, where you're supposed to be, and all that stuff. But this guy, he had gone into autopilot, right? He was just going about his normal day and his normal business, and just entered into that mode of just doing what we do, right? Just driving, going where he was supposed to go. He was used to this path. He was used to this way, and that was just what he was doing. Thankfully, before anything bad happened, he realized what was going on. He took back control, and he got back on the right path. Now, I started thinking about that along the lines of what we're dealing with, and so many different things that have been going on has just been different, right? It's a new way, and matter of fact, that's the sermon that I want to give you today. A new way when there is no way. A new way when there is no way. And you know, one way that this kind of was pointed out in my heart and my life was through camp. You know, camp is a big deal to me. You know, camp is a big deal to our youth group, our church. We have so many of you that support our teens, and so many of you that financially give and that ask for prayer requests and all those different things. You are very involved with this process of youth camp. And youth camp, honestly, we go to Word of Life Huts in Florida. It's the best camp in the universe. We love going there. And so we were on our way there, and all of a sudden we just had this I don't even know what to call it, other than I felt like God was really laying it on our hearts that we did not need to move forward anymore. Some information that we were getting, some different things that were happening, and it was like, you know what, this is not what we're supposed to be doing. And so about an hour and a half out, maybe an hour out from the camp, we made the decision to turn around and come back, and I was heartbroken. I mean, we came inside, we were unloading things. I'm crying in the bus. Teens are leaving. I've got tears running down my face. I'm going into the church trying to pull myself together. All this different stuff. And for the next 2 days, I really went through. Erica and I both went through an emotional. Like, we were just down. We were just broken. And I started, thinking about it, and I realized it was like. God was connecting to my heart and connecting to my emotions in that moment, and I realized that it took more faith for me to cancel camp than to move forward with camp. Now, hear what I'm saying. I felt guilty because I felt like I was setting a bad example for the teens. I felt like, you know what, I tell you guys to live by faith, and now because of this virus and because of the issues that are going on, I'm going to tell you, we're not going. And I felt ashamed of myself for that decision. But then in that moment, as I was praying over it and truly trying to seek God's face over it, I realized that it wasn't that I was just trying to be disobedient or anything. I genuinely felt like God was leading us a different direction. And so it took more faith for me in that moment to break the mold of what I'm used to doing and go a different direction. And guys, I want to point out, as I started thinking about that, I started thinking about different people in the Bible who did the same thing, that they were given a new way. They were given a new path, a new direction that they were going to have to go. Let me read for you a couple verses. We're in Joshua chapter 3, and we're going to look at verse number 1 here. It says in Joshua chapter 3, verse number 1, And Joshua rose early in the morning, and they removed from Shittim and came to Jordan, he and all the children of Israel, and lodged there before they passed over. And it came to pass after 3 days that the officers went through the host, and they commanded the people, saying, when you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, and the priests, the Levites, bearing it, then you shall remove from your place and go after it. Yet there shall be a space between you and it, about 2,000 cubits by measure. Come not near unto it, that ye may know the way by which ye must go, for ye have not passed this way heretofore. He says, you haven't come this way before, and so you need to have some distance between you and the ark. Why? So that you can see it. You see, as I was trying to study this out and look through this, Israel knew that they were going to be claiming the land of Canaan. They knew that they were going into this promised land and that this was theirs, right? They knew that this was going on. They knew that they were coming here. But at this point, God brings them to the river of Jordan. And as he has them there, he makes them camp out in front of this river for 3 days. And Joshua later goes on to describe that this river at the time, it was full. The banks were completely full because of the time of the year. And so at this point in time, this river that we know about would have been probably 100 yards across, to cross over 100 yards or more. It was a deep enough river that, we know that they would have had to walk probably at least waist deep, if not swim across the river. But then at this time, the way it was flowing, at least according to the commentaries that I've read, they said that this could have been moving 4 to 5 miles an hour, which doesn't sound like a big deal. But do you realize that 6 inches of moving water, moving at 7 miles an hour, is the equivalent of a F5 tornado, the winds that come through 200 miles an hour? Like, this thing is insane. That doesn't even sound right, does it? But 6 inches of water moving that fast can take you off of your feet. And this was much more than just 6 inches of water. This is a river, and they are camped out in front of this river for 3 days, watching it as it just rolls across. And I'm sure they're thinking, how are we going to cross? How are we going to get across this thing? Can you imagine, as they were thinking about their children that they were going to have to get across, the cattle, the sheep, all the equipment that they had, the elderly that they were going to have to get across this river? And as it's moving, I'm sure there's another side of this that they don't actually know how deep it is because they've never been here before. And so they're wondering, what are we facing? What are we looking at here? This isn't just a creek that we could jump across. And maybe some of them are trying to think together ways of, let's cut down some trees and lay it across. Let's build a dam and try to get across. What are we going to do to get across this thing? But as we look at it, we see that God had a plan. Can you imagine what was going through their minds? So there were so many people involved in this story. And I'm just going to summarize a lot of the story for you. We'll read some of the verses. But think about the people involved. There's Joshua, this new leader. There are the priests, the Levites that are carrying the ark. The people who had no land, who were not yet in their established place. But then there were a group of people that did have their land. And they already had what they were going to take. And yet they had made a promise to help the others get theirs. Can you imagine what's going through all these people's minds, these different characters that we're going to be reading about? Here's what I want you to think about. One thing that I want you to take away today. When going through uncharted territory, you must be in tune with God's leading. So ask yourself this question. Are you in tune with the leading of God? Are you in tune with the leading of God? What does that even mean? Well, Lincoln the other day, I could hear him in my room playing my guitar. And I walk in there to find the guitar completely out of tune because he had been playing with the little knobs up top, and one of the strings was almost completely detached from the guitar. And I thought about, man, if I tried to play this guitar right now, it would sound horrible. If I tried to play it, why? Because it's out of tune. Have you ever been driving down the road and you're listening to the radio, and as you listen to the radio, maybe you're on a trip and you've got that favorite game on, that football game or baseball game that you're listening to, or maybe you're listening to your favorite song, and as you're listening, it's probably right at the most important part of the entire thing, your favorite part of the entire thing, that you start to hear the static, right? And you start to hear this noise that makes it, oh no, it's happening. I'm losing the station. Why? You knew you were losing it because you were falling out of tune. You weren't in tune with the station anymore. Are you in tune with God's leading? Well, there are 4 things that are going to stand out. If you are in tune with God, 4 things that are going to be asked of you. And the first one is this, that you prepare yourself for the work that He will do. Prepare yourself for the work that He will do. We see this in verse number 5. Look at that with me. It says in verse 5, "And Joshua said unto the people, Sanctify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you." Sanctify yourself. Set yourself apart. And as we think about this, to set yourself apart, He's not just talking about your calendar. He's not saying, hey, tomorrow, y'all be ready because we're taking off. No. It wasn't that. It was prepare yourself spiritually, mentally, emotionally. Prepare yourself for the work that is about to take place. They were to set themselves apart from the desires that they had, the lusts that they had, all the different things that of this world that were coming up, the laziness, the attitudes of unappreciativeness, and all these different things, these doubts and fears and anxieties, all those things that were coming up in their minds as they stood in front of this river. God is saying, look, it's time for you to sanctify yourself. Set yourself apart from those things. What are some things that you need to set yourself apart from? What are some things that you need to prepare yourself? How are you preparing yourself for the work that God is doing in your life? You see, you don't know what it is that God is doing tomorrow. The people of Israel, they didn't know what was going to happen. All they knew that God was about to do wonders. They didn't know any details about it. You don't know what God is going to do tomorrow, and so you need to sanctify yourself today. Don't wait till tomorrow. Today. Sanctify yourself now. Be ready, because you don't know who that person is going to be that you're going to walk by, and you're going to see they need prayer, or they need somebody to speak truth into their life. They need somebody that can care for them, that can love them and show them the love of God. And you've got to be ready for that work. And it doesn't always happen on your time schedule. And so you need to be prepared today. Secondly, you need to present yourself for the work that He will do. Listen, but we'll see that in verse number 17. But before I get there, I want to share with you and get you kind of caught up on what's going on here. So they've been camping out, right? They've been staring at this river for a couple days now, and Joshua comes through and he explains to them that they're going to be following the Ark of the Covenant, right? They're going to be following this Ark, and that they're going to be going through, and they need to be ready. They need to be prepared, okay? So when it comes time, though, they know that they've got a certain distance that they got to keep from the Ark and all these different things, so that they can see the Ark, so that they can go, because they've never been this way before. They know all these things, that this is the plan, right? So then Joshua goes and he tells the priests what they're going to do. And Joshua's like, hey guys, listen, you are going to walk down into the river, and you're actually going to step down into the river, and you are going to walk into it while it's still running. The river that rushing river right there, you're going to walk down into that. And when you get down into it and the soles of your feet stop and they are firm on the ground, when you step down into it, the waters are going to begin to part. And as the waters part, you're going to stand in this river, and the people are going to march through, and they're going to move on, okay? They're going to come all the way through, and they're going to get to the other side. They're going to pass through on dry ground, and then you guys will come out. But you're going to stay there the whole time. And so they've got this plan in motion, right? And Joshua is told that he's going to pick out 12 guys that are going to carry these stones, but he's ready. He knows that he's got to pick these people out. He knows that the priests are going to do their job. These other guys, these 12 guys, one from each tribe, they're going to do their job. And all this stuff is about to be happening. But he's told all the people, sanctify, prepare yourself for tomorrow. Prepare yourself for what's happening. But now it's time, present yourself. Present yourself. At some point, you got to do what God is calling you to do. At some point, you have to step out and actually take action. Actually be a part of the game. Actually be a part of the plan. In verse number 17, it says, and the priest that bare the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firm on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan, and all of Israel, all the Israelites passed over on dry ground until all the people were passed clean over Jordan. It says that this is when it happened. They actually followed through. The people, they marched behind and all these different things that started to take place. But there's so much in this passage that stands out. So many things that I want to point out to you. So I'm going to look through these real quick. As they were staring at this thing, as they were looking at this river, I'm sure it was scary. I'm sure it was intimidating. I'm sure that they were afraid, but they knew that God was leading them. How? Because the Ark of the Covenant, it represented God's presence with them. And the ark, usually when they would march, the ark would usually stay either when they're resting, it would be in the center of the camp. And when they're moving forward, when they're marching, it would be in the center of this procession. And so as it is standing there in front of them and they're waiting for it to go in front of them, this is a new way of doing things. And so they're moving forward, right? And they march into Jordan, and they're having to keep about 1,000 yards between them and the ark. And as they keep this distance between them and the ark, they realize, wait a minute. They can see it. Right? Think about that for a second. It's almost a mile out in front of them. They're watching the ark. They can see for themselves. See, if they had been allowed to crowd up beside the ark, then what would have happened? People would have been all surrounding it, and there would have been some people that wouldn't have been able to see the ark. They'd have seen the front of the line. They'd have seen people marching. They would have seen that, but they wouldn't have seen the presence of God, what represented God's presence. And so as they are marching forward, as they are moving, God is telling them, I want you to keep this distance so that everyone can see me, not Joshua. Me, not the priest. Me, not the people in front of you. Not your parents, not your grandparents, not your kids. I'm not worried about you seeing those things. As you move forward, you need to be in tune with God. And so he's saying, present yourself by actually following through with what you're being called to do. By putting this distance between them, they could see it. But can you imagine think about being the priest, the first one that had to step down. I mean, somebody had to be first, right? So the first one to step down into this river. And as he steps down into this river, it takes a lot of faith, right? I mean, you don't know what's about to happen. I mean, you know what is supposed to happen. But this is a big deal. They're stepping down into a moving river, into this flowing water. As they step down into the water, I'm sure there are some nerves that are coming in with this, not only from the aspect of, what if we fall? What if we drop the ark? What if we, what if we mess this thing up, right? Because, I don't know if you've ever stepped into a river before, but it can be kind of slick, right? It's not like it's the easiest thing in the world. If you're carrying an ark on your shoulder, a very holy relic on your shoulder, it's not that easy of a task to just say, all right, walk out into that river. What if you drop it? What if something goes wrong? But these guys, they're doing what they're being told to do. And they step out into the river and they stand there. And we don't know how long it takes for the river to part. But as they are standing there, it begins to happen. The waters begin to pull back. Can you imagine being those guys? And it said that they stood there They stood there firm on the ground. They weren't slipping. They weren't falling. They were firm on that ground. And I just love that the imagery that God gives us here. See, we usually want God to part the waters before we ever step into them. We usually want God to do something about the issue in front of us before we get into it. We certainly don't want there to be any delay. But God doesn't always work that way. Sometimes God tells you, no, you step first. Just show me that you're willing to walk into the rushing water. Show me that you're willing to step down into that and be a part of this thing, and trust me that even then I would step in, and even then I would take care of you. See, God's telling them to step out before they see him at work. Let me ask you, what's keeping you from being obedient to God's call? Is it the river in front of you? Is it that workload, that thing that you're just afraid to let go of, that thing that you're afraid to get away from? What is it? You don't see clearly the path ahead, and so you're hesitant to move? See, God told them that they would need to stand in the water, the rushing water, before they would see a clear way. It was a step of faith. Then we see the ark, which again represents the presence of God. I love this. It didn't just walk through the water and continue on. Once it got into the water and the waters began to part, the people began marching through. The ark stayed in the river. The ark stayed in the river. See, God is leading you, but he isn't leaving you. God is leading you, but he isn't leaving you. God is there in the midst of that river. In the midst of that scary thing that you're facing off, against that scary thing that you're having to look at, and it's taken everything in you to even step out by faith. Listen, God isn't on the other side of the river saying, hey, come on. God is in the river. And what's even more crazy about this is that this is a fulfillment of a promise, right? God had told them that everywhere that the sole of your foot touches, this will be yours. This will belong to you. And in this passage, it actually emphasizes, I think it's in verse 13, it emphasizes that it would be the sole of their feet that would touch the bottom of the Jordan. And so this Jordan, they didn't even realize it at the time, I'm sure, but this Jordan was going to belong to them. Why? Not because it cut through their land, but because they cut through the Jordan. The Jordan belonged to them because they walked through it on dry ground. They began to march. Such an awesome thought that this dangerous yet life-giving river belonged to them as they stepped down into it. You know that thing that's scaring you to death right now? That trial, that whatever it is that's in front of you, that you're afraid to step out and follow God and do that thing. Listen, it belongs to you if you're willing to step out and follow God into it. Follow God into whatever it is that he's calling you to. Don't just follow the old street signs. Don't just follow the old roadway just because that's what you're used to. Don't just go into autopilot, but actually be in tune with God's leading. You got to be in tune. Prepare yourself for what he will do and present yourself for what he will do. And then thirdly, preserve yourself for the work that he will do. I told you there are many different characters that are in this passage that we're looking at. And as we look into it, we see that one of them was the soldiers from these tribes that were also following with the rest of the Israelites. They were part of the Israelites, but they're going to be staying on this side of the Jordan. They already have their land, right? But it says specifically in chapter 4 and verse number 12, it says, and the children of Reuben and the children of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh passed over armed before the children of Israel as Moses spake unto them. About 40,000 prepared for war passed over before the Lord unto battle to the plains of Jericho. As we look at this, we see that these are men that are following through with a promise, yes. But they are men who already had their land. There were men who already had their side of the deal already fixed, right? It was already working out for them. And so I'm sure they had plans. I'm sure they had things that they could have been doing. They had families that were staying on this side of the river. They had loved ones and they had all their cattle, and they had their homes that needed to be built, and they had all this stuff that needed to be established. And yet here they are crossing this river, going to leave all of that in order to go to this. I'm sure they had busy schedules. I'm sure they had full calendars. I'm sure they had plenty of things that they could have been doing, but they preserved themselves for the work that God had called them to do. I mean, think about all the excuses that could have come up. I mean, I can't leave my family. We're leaving. 40,000 of our troops are leaving. What if somebody attacks my family? What if something happens? What if my kids get sick? What if while we're gone, it storms real bad and we don't have our homes established? We don't have all these things established like we wanted. What if, what if, what if? And they could have been thinking about all these different things, but they didn't make those excuses. They didn't lay those excuses out there. They had preserved themselves because they knew they had made a promise. They knew they had made a commitment that they needed to follow through on. And so you see that these men decided to move forward, decided to follow through with what they had been called to do. Yeah, they were prepared, and yes, they as we look at this, they were present, they were ready for the action, but they had preserved themselves for this work. They had preserved themselves, and they didn't fill up their calendars with so many different things to do. Joshua had also picked out 12 men that would carry these stones, and they didn't necessarily know what their jobs were going to be when he picked them out. He just picked out 12 men from each tribe and had them come, and they were ready with him. And then when the time came, he tells them, listen, okay, here's what you're going to do. Over there by where the priests are standing, you are going to go and pick up 12 stones, put them up on your shoulders, and you're going to carry them across. Carry them across the river and take them to where we're camping out. Just that's your job. And so as these guys who had been standing here, they had been ready. I mean, they had their families that they were supposed to help. They had their families that they were supposed to guide and be with. And yet they had, instead of filling their time with all those other priorities, they knew that God was calling them to do something else. And they maybe had goals. They maybe had desires of things that they wanted to do in this time frame. But they knew that they needed to be ready for what God was calling them to do. They didn't make excuses. They picked up the stones and they carried these stones over. They weren't worried about their own plans or fulfilling their own time schedules, their own priorities. They preserved themselves for the work that God was going to do in them and in this work. See, this is probably the hardest part of the whole process. Everything is calling out to us. Everything is saying, hey, come do this, come do that. People, friends, loved ones, Christians, all the people in the world want you to go a different direction. They try to fill up your time schedule. They try to fill up your calendar, but it's so difficult because every time you say yes to them, you're saying no to something else. And the reality is you need to preserve yourself for what God is calling you to do. Now, that's not me giving you an excuse to be lazy. That's not me giving you an excuse to be rude or to be to constantly shoot people down when they come up with new ideas or whatever. What I'm trying to tell you is that you don't need to be mama called. Listen, when I was growing up, my pastor used to talk about preachers who were mama called. They weren't called by God, they were called by their parents. Their parents pressured them into doing ministry. Their parents pressured them into making decisions. And he always warned us, don't be mama called, be God called. Don't just do something because other people are pressuring you to do it. Do it because God is calling you to do it. See, I want you involved in ministry, absolutely, but I want you involved in the right ministry. I want you involved in what God is calling you to do because that's where you're going to be passionate. That's where you're going to be gifted. That's where you're going to be obedient to God. And you're going to have God's power working through you. It's difficult though, right? It's difficult to preserve yourself for certain things, to say no to others. It's difficult because it's not always bad things that fill up our calendar. It's work, it's school, it's friends and family, it's all those different things. Even church at times, different ministry opportunities, what we call them. But the reality is, I need to make sure that as I'm moving forward, that I'm moving forward with God's call, that I'm moving forward with what God is telling me to do. So preserve yourself for the work that God will do with you. See, sometimes we burn ourselves out trying to fulfill ministry that we actually have no business doing. Trying to fulfill goals and different things like that for people that's not what we were called to do. That's not what God's leading us to do. Preserve yourself for the work of God. And then finally, and this will be quick, praise God for the work that He will do. Chapter 4 and verse number 21, it says, "And he spake unto the children of Israel, saying, When your children shall ask their fathers in time to come, saying, What mean these stones?
Then you shall let your children know, saying, Israel came over this Jordan on dry land. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of Jordan from before you until you were passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up before us until we were gone over, that all the people of the earth might know the hand of the Lord, that it is mighty, that ye might fear the Lord your God forever. We need to praise God for the work that he will do. You see, they set up these stones as a place of remembrance, a place of praise and worship to God. As they would come by and see these stones and their children would ask about them, they were going to be sharing the glory and the power of God. It was a place of worship. And what's interesting about this is that God wasn't done yet. And yet they were already establishing and setting up praise for what God had done right there and what God was going to do in the future, giving them that land. But based on these things, they were ready to worship. Not only were these stones a memorial for them to remember, but it was a place for the Canaanites, for the cities in Canaan to look at. And as they saw these things, they were filled with fear. It was going to be a place of recognition even for them. And so, Israel, they didn't realize this, but for Israel, it was a sign of God's provision. But for the people of Canaan, it was a sign of God's wrath. You see, the chapter 5, it talks about how the hearts of the kings of those cities, they were filled with dread. Their hearts melted, the Bible said, because I'm sure they had heard stories about these wilderness people on the other side of the river. They had heard about the way God delivered them from Egypt, the way God had all the miraculous things that God had done with them, their victory over the Amalekites. I'm sure that as they looked at all this, the thing that they considered their safety, a part of maybe a barrier that kept them from these people, was that river. But now when they heard that the river had been dried up and that the Israelites had crossed over, they knew they were in trouble. They knew that there was a problem, because these people had a God who truly intervened, who truly fought on their behalf. They were petrified. Israel didn't know that these kings were afraid, but they were ready to worship because they knew what God was doing. Let me ask you, are you being intentional about your worship? Are you being intentional about setting up altars of worship for God? David wrote in Psalm 26, verses 6 and 7, I will wash my hands in innocency, so will I compass thine altar, O Lord, that I may publish with the voice of thanksgiving and tell of all the wondrous works, all thy wondrous works. What altars have you set up? Have you shared stories with your children, with your family, with your friends about God's deliverance? Have you taught them? Have you showed them how God has been at work in your life? Are you sharing these stories? See, God doesn't want you to keep those all to yourself. God wants you to share them. God wants you to tell of his greatness. In my opinion, this story, as we read these two chapters, it's all about the provision of God, but not necessarily material things. Not necessarily the provision in the sense that God is just taking care of material things. You know what Joshua needed? Joshua needed confirmation. If you read through those verses there in chapter 3, you see that very clearly. Joshua needed confirmation. Joshua needed for the people to see that he was the new Moses, that he was the new leader. He needed that for himself. He needed to know that God was going to work in him the same way he had been working in Moses. You know what the people needed? They needed to see that God was still at work in their day, that he wasn't just a story of old, that he wasn't just a myth that their parents told them about. They needed to see that God was at work right here in them, in the present, that God was still alive doing things. That's what they needed. See, he is the God of all provision. He is everything that they needed, and he is everything you will need. He provides even now. So let me ask you, what is it that you need? What provision is it that you need? As you go this new way where there is no way, you're walking in a new way. What do you need? And not just material things, but what do you really need from God? When you're going through uncharted territory, you must be in tune with God's leading. Prepare yourself for the work that he will do. Present yourself for the work that he will do. preserve yourself for the work that He will do. Finally, praise God for the work that He will do.